aren't just one or two factors that caused the Dieppe raid to fail. In fact, there are more than you think. But to understand them, it's important to know what was going on in Russia at the time and why this raid was needed in the first place. The Dieppe raid took place on August 19, 1942, on the French port of Dieppe, which was under control of the Germans during the Second World War. Russia wanted the English to open a second front in northwest Europe. By doing so, it would provide the Soviets a much-needed relief. This is because Hitler's army wouldn't be using all their power to fight the Soviets at one front. This raid would also help to test new equipment and techniques, help morale of the population, and bring Canadian soldiers some action. At first, the operation of the Battle of Dieppe was known as Operation Rudder. It had gliders, paratroopers, heavy bombers, and Royal Navy ships which would pound the port's defenses, cover the evacuation, and also protect the infantry from counterattacks. However, this operation was cancelled on July 7, 1942, due to mostly unfavorable weather conditions. But later, Operation Rudder was revived and renamed Operation Jubilee. No one knows why or how this occurred, or who was responsible for remounting the raid. Usually, when raids were remounted, they did not occur at the same destination because of the likeliness of German spies in England finding out. But Operation Jubilee was to take place where Rudder would have, because the High Command did not consider it a security risk. Many Dieppe veterans felt the Germans had known about this raid beforehand. Unlike Operation Rudder, Operation Jubilee did not have a lot of strong forces. They underestimated the enemy's power. The Canadians found out that they were going to attack Dieppe one day before the actual attack. Captain Dennis Whittaker, who was one of the few to survive the raid, states that the officers had no real training, so they simply played soldier on weekends. He was shot through his leg and taken prisoner. During captivity, he reflected on the raid's evolution. He says, "I don't know who dreamt it up, but they didn't know anything about fighting a war. It was terrible planning, just awful, absolutely ridiculous." Operation Jubilee had military forces starting from 5 different ports along the English coast: Southampton, Portsmouth, Gosport, Shoreham, and New Haven. The plan was to have 5 separate attacks, including the main attack on Dieppe. The other 4 attacks were from the side and less important. The 4 flank attacks were to be delivered by surprise at 4:50 a.m. Then the Dieppe attack would occur 30 minutes later at 5:20 a.m. One flank attack was at Varnesville by the No. 4 Commando. Another was on Pourville by the South Saskatchewan Regiment and the Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders of Canada. One was on Pies by the Royal Regiment of Canada, and the 4th flank attack was on Berneville by the No. 3 Commando. Varnesville and Pourville attacks were on the west of Dieppe, and Pies and Berneville were on the east. As I stated before, all these flank attacks were supposed to occur at the same time, 30 minutes before the main attack on Dieppe. I'll be talking more about each of these attacks, but briefly, the Berneville attack failed, Varnesville succeeded, Pourville failed, and Pies failed. Why? Well, let's see. The attack at Pies was by the Royal Regiment of Canada, and it was an eastern flank attack. It relied on the element of surprise, and its goal was to capture the headland east of Jubilee. What caused this attack to fail? Well, the naval landing was delayed, and they arrived 30 minutes late in the morning light, so the element of surprise was lost. When they arrived, the Germans were already waiting for them, and so they fought but failed to achieve their goal. The attack at Bernaville was by the Number 3 Commando and like Pies was an eastern flank attack. It also relied on the element of surprise, but on the way there they encountered a German convoy, which resulted in a sharp, violent sea fight. The crafts carrying the Number 3 Commando were scattered and most of the unit never reached shore. The ones who approached shore were overwhelmed and managed to get a safe distance away from the Germans until they were evacuated 2.5 hours later. The attack on Pourville was by the South Saskatchewan Regiment and the Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders of Canada. This was a western flank attack that relied on the element of surprise. Unlike Pies and Berneval, the surprise succeeded, but the attack did not. They did not achieve their goal of capturing the headlands west of Jubilee. The attack at Varengeville was by the Number 4 Commando, and this attack was a western flank attack like Pourville. This attack captured all its objectives and was a success. They destroyed the guns in the battery near Varengeville and then withdrew safely. Now I'll be talking about the main attack, which was the attack on Dieppe. The beach was overlooked by 45-meter tall cliffs, and it was flat and open with pebbles that would be slippery when wet. The German troops were ready and on full alert because it seemed the tide and weather conditions were good for a raid. So the beach was covered with pillboxes, barbed wire, vehicle obstacles, and huge blockades. As soldiers arrived at the main attack at Dieppe, they were met with a hail of bullets from the headlines, making it clear the Pies and Pourville attacks had not succeeded. The Calgary Regiment was put ashore 10 to 15 minutes late, so the soldiers did not have tanks for a while to support them. Not only that, but the aircraft had departed, so the streets of Dieppe were unprotected and were blocked by massive concrete obstacles. When the tanks did arrive, they still couldn't solve the issues with the concrete obstacles, shingle, or the seawall. So the soldiers returned to the beach, waiting for evacuation while helping others by firing back. For 100 minutes, the soldiers waited. As the first boat approached land, soldiers were hoping to be evacuated. However, instead of taking survivors, they brought more soldiers to fight. This is because the Canadian general in command of the assault thought they were on the road to success. Then later, another boat came based on another false report that the tanks were doing well and that the casino and beach were in Canadian hands. Eventually, some soldiers were evacuated, some were made prisoners, and the wounded and dead were carried away by waves. So, as I discussed, the plan was seriously flawed. The planners did not provide enough weapon utilities for the attackers and relied on the element of surprise because they underestimated the power of the Germans. The tank support plan was also flawed. They arrived late, so they weren't able to help the soldiers for the first 10 to 15 minutes. Even after the tanks showed up, they were not able to help the soldiers advance to Dieppe because of the issues with the concrete obstacles, shingle, and the seawall. The flank attack plans were too complex, and if one failed, it would have put the main plan at risk, which they did. 70% of Canadians did not return. Many were made prisoners, and soon many families across Canada would receive telegrams notifying them of their loss of a loved one. Canadian generals received a lot of criticism from Canada. Prisoners were forced to parade the streets of Dieppe with Germans, which was a humiliating experience for them. Canadians will always be honored. The Battle of Dieppe, however, did not help Russia or the morale of the population. It did bring Canadian soldiers some action, but it shook their confidence. Many people believe that the important lessons learned at the Battle of Dieppe were crucial to the success of the D-Day landings in 1944. Others believe that it was a poorly planned, disastrous operation, that it was to satisfy the ego, ambition, and the enthusiasm of the higher-ups. Now you've learned about why the Dieppe raid failed and the impact it had on Canada and Canadians at the time. In addition, you've learned why the Dieppe raid happened, the flank attacks involved, and what people believe about the Battle of Dieppe. Thanks for listening.